Now it's time for our first panel. We've got loads on the way today, but this is our first one. It's called Why Plant-Based? So have you ever wondered about how to eat more plant-based, how to kind of eat a little bit better, but you get a little bit overwhelmed, you're not sure the best place to start? Well, these guys have got all the top tips that you'd possibly need to know. And they're going to tell you all about the advantages of it as well, you know, for your health, the planet, and of course, for animals. So let me bring back Maggie. I'm also going to bring back Robbie Lockie, who will be moderating, and the guest as well, Isaias Hernandez. Please give them a huge round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Keeping the energy high? So, today, we're going to talk about why plant-based. Can I get a show of hands in the house who eats a plant-based diet or who's tried a plant-based diet? Wow, a good few people. So, let's kick things off. Maggie, over to you. So, why plant-based? How did you discover this lifestyle?
Well, I began my plant-based journey really young. I grew up in a small town in western Colorado, and very in love with the out of doors, and did not want to eat animals from a very, very early age. So I started being a vegetarian very young, and then when I moved to New York City in 1981, I saw an infographic. I think it was a t-shirt, and it showed how much of the Amazon rainforest was being destroyed to make one hamburger, basically. And this was a real eye-opener for me. I really had not known I hadn't even thought about it, and it just was shocking, and that really started me on the journey of plant-based, not only for animal welfare, but also for addressing climate change. Later, my mother died suddenly of a heart attack in her 50s, so I really had all three of the main reasons that people adopt a plant-based diet very strongly ingrained in my body.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing, Maggie. And over to you, Isaias. What was your connection with plant-based?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Maggie. You know, I would say that for me, it started at a young age. I grew up in poverty, living in Los Angeles, and you know, my parents had just immigrated from Mexico, and we grew up like what you would call like a food desert or food apartheid, which is basically lack of access to fresh and culturally appropriate foods. And I remember going a lot to, you know, food shelters and like, you know, having food stamps and like asking myself, like, why is there so much meat and dairy products and processed foods and no single vegetable or fruits? Or if it was in a canned, which was near its expiration date. And so I think for me, it was more about the fact of like my body at a young age was like rejecting meat and dairy. Like I would always tell my parents, like, you know, I'm having really bad stomach aches, I don't feel good. And they would take me to the hospital, and then they would tell me, it's just your anxiety. And then I realized that it wasn't my anxiety, it was literally the food that I was eating. And so I think for plant-based, for me, it's more about, you know, reconnecting to your cultural roots, because all of us here like have culture. We all have stories. Many of us come from different types of lands and geographic regions where the foods that we eat are very culturally appropriate to our bodies and really allows us to achieve that equilibrium. And so for me, living in LA, navigating plant-based, you know, diets, it was more about how do I get more people who grew up in poverty and poor to get access to food, because we produce so much food already. It's confirmed that. It's just that it's not equally and evenly redistributed in communities of color like that look like mine.
Amazing, thank you for sharing. My personal story with plant-based begins about 8 years ago. I grew up in sunny Zimbabwe in Africa, and eating meat and consuming animal products was such a normal part of my life. Where I come from, you know, people breathe air and they eat meat, and they think those two things are the most important thing in their lives. And it was something that was always sort of taught to me as a child. I was taught that eating meat was normal, natural, and necessary. I had to do it. And about 8 years ago, I was experiencing a lot of health problems, a lot of bloating, skin conditions, eczema, psoriasis, tiredness. I was very unwell. And I started to investigate, you know, the effect of diet on my body. And I watched this incredible documentary, Forks Over Knives, Food Inc. And these films really opened my mind and opened my eyes to the power of nutrition and how our diet can affect our bodies. And of course, then that expanded onto the planet and how a plant-based diet can affect the way we live as human beings. And we'll get into that in the discussion. But within a few weeks of switching to a plant-based diet, many of my health conditions started to clear up. I had more energy, I felt more alive, and I'd seen many, many doctors try to help me solve these problems, and they were saying, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Mm-hmm. And 8 years later, I've never been healthy, so it's definitely something that we all absolutely love. So, but just before we continue, obviously you want to define what a plant-based diet is, because there may be people in the audience who may not know exactly what that means. And it's a diet that is made consistently of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. And it excludes all animal products, including red meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and dairy products. So, let's get started about one of the main points about a plant-based diet and how it affects the planet, or what we call the plant-based quadfecta, which is human health, planetary health, animal welfare, and reduction of pandemic risk. But let's start with planetary health, Maggie. Let's talk about the effects that plant-based diet has on the planet, and what is it from your perspective?
Well, I'll go back to that date, 1981, and I think we think we're discovering all this, but people have been telling us this for years, that we were headed for exactly where we are now. I think many of you may know, and Isaias is great with statistics, that the inefficiency of an animal agriculture diet is really the problem, along with the emissions of greenhouse gases from the methane created from animals as well. So, basically, many of you probably realize, if you take all the grains and vegetables and feed them to animals, how much food will you get out of there? It's considerably less, using tremendous amounts of water and soil. I bet you have those stats.
Yeah, I would say that to kind of start off is like, how much are we producing of natural resources being used for products? So if we look at, a pound of a beef meat, right, it takes like 20 to 30 gallons of water just to produce one. And the environmental impact to produce like plant-based items like legumes, beans, other materials, they use less amount of water. And so when we look at the data that has shown in industrial agriculture, specifically like meat factory farms, you'll see that the amount of water they've been using is depleting natural reservoirs, and it's also contaminating local water sites. So right now, if you go to certain rural communities where they're located nearby factory farms, you'll see that there's a higher level rate of air pollution. I believe that you're 4 times more likely to develop heart disease and other respiratory illnesses. And then when it comes to water pollution, obviously if children are drinking that at a young age, it's going to cause brain development issues because of the nitrate and elements that are also harmful on that end. But shifting just to a plant-based diet has shown in our global food supply chain that it can reduce it to 40 to 50% of our current usage. And that's actually really needed, because what we're seeing right now is industrial agriculture is continuously growing year over year, where they're continuously putting more subsidies into more meat, more dairy. And what that's going to cause in the future is going to cause an ecological collapse, where local farmers have been displaced from their own lands. They've been displaced of their own knowledge. And for us to feed this titan, right, what you would call it, we're essentially just pushing for our resources to be depleted, and also for our future generations to have less items and less access to food.
So when it comes to some of the other effects of animal agriculture, deforestation is a huge problem. What a lot of people don't realize is when a piece of meat arrives on your plate, that animal may consume vast quantities of water. And as you can see this powerful statistic on the screen behind us. But there's also the land that is cleared to plant soybeans so that people can eat those animals. The animal agriculture industry clears vast swathes of forests, and it is becoming an ever increasingly large problem. Maggie, when it comes to sort of like the diet that people eat on a daily basis, perhaps the SAD diet, the standard American diet, what do you think it will take to help people understand the impact of the individual dishes? Because I think when people buy their food from the supermarket and they purchase those products, they don't see the supply chain that exists behind that individual steak. But what do you think we need to see more of to help people see the big picture?
I think the first thing we need to do is break the chain of disinformation, which we were speaking about earlier. There is a lot at work in promoting misinformation because of the market value to the corporations who stand to benefit from that. So the first thing we have to do is get around that. So a lot of us have to get around our own indoctrination into what is a healthy meal, first of all. Many of us have been taught from early age, you have to eat meat, you have to eat dairy. And so we have that deep indoctrination, and it's informed our taste buds as well as all of our habits. So the first thing is we have to break that, so that we have to know, oh, okay, this plant-based diet is actually healthy for you. It's actually tasty. That's another challenge, right? Because people want to do the least challenging thing. We just do by nature. Our days are hard. We want to make our day less stressful, right? So how can we make it less stressful? We eat something we like, right? So it's really important that we have this advent of plant-based products and plant-based menu items, et cetera, that people can eat so that they can, first of all, get turned on to the fact that this food that is better for the planet is also healthy for a human. I'd love it if you talk about the disinformation right there.
Absolutely. So there's two types of information in this sense. There's misinformation, there's disinformation. And misinformation is knowledge or content that you may share on social media that you assume to be true, but it may be untrue. But you share it because maybe your mum shared it or your dad shared it or one of your friends shared it because you trust that connection on social networks. But behind that misinformation is often a lot of disinformation, which is information that is created by organizations specifically to seed doubt into the public. They want people to focus on maintaining the status quo, whether it's their diet, whether it's politics, whatever. There's a lot of information that's put out in this disinformation way, and it's designed to spread. I don't know if everyone's seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma. It really talks a lot about this study on Netflix, which, on Twitter, sorry, which talked about how misinformation actually spreads 6 times, 7 times faster than true information. So we have to be very careful about what we share on social media when it comes to facts and information, because what it can do is it can perpetuate mistruths that can really affect people's lives. And of course, the climate crisis is a big part of that. So be very conscious about what you're sharing. And I'd love to hear what you think, Isaias, about misinformation, about the knowledge we have on social media, and how we can kind of really decide whether something is worth sharing or not.
Yeah, I'd say that reimagining interrogation into education as an opportunity, what I think right now, since we become very politicized over the last few years, is that it's almost an either-or situation, right? Either you're going to be talking about this, or if you don't, you're a bad person. And so I think that we have to understand, like with all of us here, like all of our friends that want to learn more about plant-based eating, or like what is the best information out there? How do I educate people who are younger than me, is about asking where is the resources coming from, where exactly is producing this information, who funded the research, because more often than not, you'll realize that the research that is being funded right now by certain corporations and large-scale industries is directly going into squashing these plant-based companies or to these experts that have been in this field. And the other thing is that how language is such a powerful tool that is also a dangerous tool, meaning that there are people that often really get into this pipeline, into the outright, in perpetuating many harmful ideologies that directly are displacing and also harming a lot of Black, Indigenous people of color globally. So if we're not really asking more questions and critical thoughts about, where's our food coming from and who is sponsoring these types of policies, why aren't we able to fight against these industries through the legal lens, then we're missing information that's going to lead to a lot of people having fragmented frameworks, that's going to lead them to have more questions and more anger towards the subject that leads to violence.
So one of the playbooks out there that the tobacco industry used for many, many years was a leaked memorandum, and the title of that memorandum was "Doubt is Our Product." And the focus of the tobacco industry was to really create enough doubt in the public and the people's minds over whether smoking was dangerous or not, whether it would kill you or not, or cause disease. It took 9,000 studies for the powers that be, essentially in the United States, to finally put through legislation that showed how smoking caused cancers and killed people. The animal agriculture industry is operating around the same playbook. There's a lot of misinformation being put out on a daily basis, and it really distorts the truth and the true picture about what's happening out there in the world today. And this is often done in a way to create a picture of how agriculture and how animals are farmed in this beautiful, idyllic way, and that there's green fields and there's cows and chickens grazing freely. And I turn to you, Maggie, about this picture, about how our perceptions are incredibly distorted when it comes to, when you go to the supermarket, you might see all this imagery, but what is the actual truth of the matter when it comes to what actually is going on these farms?
Well, I fell victim to it too. You know, I was, you know, on a tour bus the other day looking at the fields and the little dotting of cows, and that's what we're sort of fed as the image of meat and dairy products and poultry, et cetera. But the vast majority of the animal products that are consumed are created in factory farms. Enormous, vast plants where animals are raised in horrific conditions, using up vast amounts of land and water, and also the methane gas created by cattle and other animals in the burping and the farting is a tremendous source of toward the greenhouse gas effect. So these are, the real images are quite startling and shocking. And also I think it's really important that we talk about the human toll of these things, because humans are suffering at a tremendous rate. Humans that live near these plants suffer from high levels of cancers and other diseases created by the water runoff from the plants and the air pollution. Also, when we have breakouts like E. coli breakouts, often those come from something like lettuce or spinach, and so we think of that as a vegetable, but that's not really coming from the vegetable, that's coming from the water, from the waste stream from the animal agriculture that then infuses the plant. So there's so much disease associated with this and so much human suffering that we really don't focus on the toll to humans in this. We are really fed this, you know, talking chickens asking for you to eat them, and, you know, happy cows asking you, you know, it's really warping our brain. And I feel like if we had a mainstream commercial, which we are starting to, fortunately, that shows the actual process and of getting this meat, it would be very insightful to people.
Absolutely, there's some good feedback there. And Isaias, when it comes to the true picture of animal agriculture, what does that mean to you, and about us breaking that facade, that mirage that exists in our lives, in our supermarkets, in our magazines, on TV ads? From your view, how do we help people see through it?
Yeah, you know, I would say it's starting with yourself, right? Like a really quick activity for everyone is like, think about 5 brands in your head that you can think of, right? I can easily think about 4 right now. And then let me ask you, can you think of 4 to 5 plant species in your local environment? And most often not, people are like, I can only name 1 or 2 on top of my head. So there is this loss of local knowledge that is happening for a lot of people, where we put so much value into these corporations and institutions that necessarily have poisoned our food system. And one thing I really want people to conceptualize or to kind of understand is that the reason why these industries have so much money is that governments have allowed them to essentially give them money in order for them to keep meat and dairy prices at a fixed cost. And so the true fact is that, like, a lot of these industries don't make their money out of our profits. They make money out of subsidies. And so a lot of the arguments go behind of like, well, is it our government or is it the corporations? If you walk into a supermarket today, there's around 50 to 70% of the grocery items you see on a shelf are owned by very few powerful corporations. And that leads us to ask us, who has control over what we eat? And that in itself is not to say that, you know, there's all these evil actors, but rather to say, how do we redistribute power that is currently happening to get us to our local knowledge? Because what I want people to kind of take away from this is that if we're not able to understand the power structure behind these hierarchies in our food system, then we ourselves are going to fail, because we all know at the end of the day that the reasons why a lot of charities and food banks exist is because they know that the corporations are going to take a stance and say, well, at least we're helping by donating this amount, therefore this is the solution. Obviously, we know that we haven't ended food hunger to end that, and it costs almost a fraction of what billionaires make, and we can easily find those solutions by empowering people. The other thing I want to kind of lastly say is that, you know, our whole food system is essentially rigged in this game where the privatization of seeds are patented, meaning that local farmers in different countries are now being criminalized for using certain seeds. Our fertilizers that we're using have high levels amounts of chemicals. Our own, what you would say, the products that are being used like meat and stuff, it's like a whole pipeline with human health, because we all know that the people that are making our meat and dairy are people primarily who are undocumented. And in California, when I went to those farms and I went inside those factories, I've talked to a lot of the people that don't speak the English. They are people that look like me that are Latin, and they are feared every day of their lives because they have to either face deportation from the immigration, or fact that they face high rates of abuse and violence. And this becomes a human rights issue. This becomes a women's rights issue. This becomes a children's rights issue, where there is people that are 13 to 14, 15 working on these farms illegally for our food system. And that in it itself is an injustice. And our government acknowledge that, but they value cheap labor over actually valuing people. So I'd say that continuously to asking questions and being curious was a really step way for me to understand, like, how can I start to talk about food systems and access to plant-based diets to make it accessible for my family, for my friend, for my cousins.
Thank you, Isaiah. One of the topics that comes up quite a lot is the idea of what's natural. As we talked about misinformation or disinformation coming out of the animal agriculture industry, that vegan burgers are not natural, that they're full of lots of unnecessary ingredients. But ironically, you know, when we look at animal agriculture, a lot of hormones, a lot of antibiotics, a lot of damaging chemicals, PCBs, are really running off into our environment. But there is a narrative as well that what if we put cows on grass fields and everyone ate grass-fed beef? Wouldn't that make everything okay? And what do you think about that, Maggie? Should everyone be eating grass-fed beef?
Well, it's just a numbers game, right? If you can't do it, right? If you are like, okay, well, I'll only eat grass-fed beef with perfectly no hormones. If then you just imagine millions and millions of people doing it. It's literally not possible, you know. And I suppose maybe it's possible, and I would need a scientist to say that if every human said, well, I'm going to eat, you know, 1 tablespoon of grass-fed meat a year, that might be possible. But you know, there's only so much land, and there's only so much water.
We need several planets, wouldn't we?
It's really just not possible. It's kind of that's just an idea of the privileged, right? So when someone says to you, like, well, that's all I do, it's like, well, you are the privileged person in the world who is taking up that spot. But that can't be for the masses. It's not mathematically, scientifically possible to sustain that. The many diets that people follow that are very meat heavy are not sustainable diets for the planet.
I'd love to turn to you, as I was talking about privilege and food privilege, and that plant-based diets and animal-based diets are very different in nature, but food systems are very different all over the world. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about those differences and how access to food and food equity is not always something to be assumed. We live in quite a wealthy country. You know, you walk into the supermarket, you always have access to food, relatively affordable food for now. But there are other parts of the world where this just doesn't exist.
Yeah, you know, I'd say that when we're checking our privilege and navigating these conversations of like, well, how do I get people to go plant-based when my own family didn't even have access to farmers markets? And why is it that there's so many people who are in poverty and low income in the UK feel so much shame going into a food shelter to ask for food? Why is it that? I mean, that's because our society has deemed to criminalize people who are poor just for their existence, rather than asking ourselves, this situation is unjust, and the fact that these people don't even have access to these foods is terribly wrong. So I'd say that in terms of privilege and power dynamics, that we kind of ask ourselves, what am I currently doing in order to really ensure that people have access to food, right? I know a lot of people are saying, well, I don't really have that much money, I don't have the power, but the reality is that there's a lot of forms of indigenous knowledge and a lot of cultural knowledge that our ancestors have passed down on us, right? I really love to partake in foraging as an act of ecological reverence and love for the land. And there's so much edible food out there in public spaces that you can easily pick for free, and actually teach younger people out there of like, how do you get people to get access to food? Because a lot of times I don't have access to garden. In my community, all the soil is contaminated due to Superfund sites that contaminate the region. And so there's all these like difficulties where we're asking ourselves, how do I continue to fight against these systems when it seems that it's almost impossible? But the reality is that your own existence is a solution, and it takes time to build community, and takes time to validate your lived experiences to say, no, I am an expert in this situation. And the other thing is, like, in terms of privilege, when it comes to like looking at different countries and different locations, asking yourself like, what is currently available in your region? Because if we ate a diet that is consistent of our local foods, we wouldn't have access to these types of exotic fruits today here in the global north. And that is something that I experienced in the global south. When I visited, I was like not eating certain products that I have access to, and realizing the fact of like, it's not the same everywhere, but we can make a difference by understanding these methods and these systems that these communities have built without industrial agriculture, and replicate them within our own communities.
Turn the conversation now onto the food itself. So obviously there's a lot of people in the audience who eat a plant-based diet or who've experimented with a plant-based diet, but there are a lot of misconceptions about the diet itself. Often, as I said, brought on by misinformation and a lot of, frankly, nonsense out there on the internet. But Maggie, what are some of the top misconceptions that you've heard about a plant-based diet?
Well, the main ones are you won't get enough protein and you won't get enough calcium. I think those are generally the ones we all hear for our whole lives.
Over and over and over again.
Over and over, and they're just simply not factually based. So, but that's the main one. It is true that you should take some vitamin supplements if you're on a fully plant-based diet, but that's true for every diet currently because of our food system, our soil being so depleted that much of our food now is not rich in the vitamins that it once was. So a vitamin is pretty necessary for everyone, but definitely in a plant-based diet, a vitamin B is necessary. And are there any other big myths? Those are the ones that have been drilled into me my whole life.
I would say the idea that you can't get everything you need from a plant-based diet, but according to the British Dietetic Association and the American Dietetic Association, a well-planned vegan diet is suitable for human beings of all ages. So there are reputable organizations out there who back this way of eating and living, so there certainly isn't any concern. There obviously are things like B12, which is made by cyanobacteria in the soil, and we can do that. We can absorb that very easily by having a supplement, or you can have it in your fortified milks. You might hear people say, well, that's not natural. But that's what we call an appeal to nature fallacy, because what's natural about human society? Our buildings and our cars and our factories, the way we live, our airplanes, our society isn't quote unquote natural. So, but what we can do as people is we can live one of the most environmentally friendly diets, as it suggests on the fact but behind us, and supplement it with something that's super easy, it's super affordable. So
I would also like to say natural. Hundreds of years ago, people died from rickets and scurvy, all kinds of things. So, supplementing a diet with a vitamin or knowing something about nutrition is an advance in modern science. It's not a downside.
Turning to Isaias, what is one of the biggest challenges that you think that people have to eating and trying a plant-based diet?
I think it's giving up cheese. I think for a lot of people, they always tell me, I can't give up cheese, but the huge challenge is actually training your mindset of like, how do I be imperfect while unlearning perfectionism? Because a lot of people always say it's either or you're either for this or either for that. And that's so harmful because as humans, we don't operate that way, right? We don't give our friends ultimatum of like, whose side are you gonna choose, mine or theirs? It's more about like, can we talk this out? And so I tell people that like, reductionism for me in a lifestyle has helped me so much because I've realized that it's sustainable for my mental health and my physical health. I've had people who have come up to me malnourished after trying certain plant-based diets, and I talk to them like, what's happening? And a lot of them say, I don't have access or control of what I buy at my home because my parents have full control over that. And I tell them, you should never, ever subject yourself to physical or mental health deterioration if you're going to choose a plant-based diet or veganism, because that is not the way you should do it. You should do it through care, you should do it through slow time, through your own agenda. And so just reminding people that being gentle to your heart and spirit can really go a long way, rather than just trying to get this goal so then you can be included with the community, right?
And also eating more as well. You should and can eat a lot more on a plant-based diet, obviously a healthier plant-based diet. I think plant ingredients often contain a lot less calories, and so you might make a giant plate of a salad or vegetables and think that's a lot of calories, that's a lot of food, but actually because it's filled mostly with water and fiber, it's more likely to fill you up. So you want to eat a lot more of the food, and don't be afraid of carbs. We've become a carb-phobic society, and I think don't be afraid of the old potato, in my opinion.
I think there's two things that are really important. One is that we're motivated, as we said before, by taste, right? And also convenience. So taste and convenience are sort of things you have to overcome or figure out a way to access or cook or prepare foods that is tasty, but it's also convenience. What can you afford? What can you find? So those things really play into whether you're going to find success in this journey. But as you said, I think a mindset is extremely important. And so when we talk about the effects of climate change and a plant-based diet, I think believing that, really understanding that, is a huge motivator. There's nothing stronger than a belief. There's nothing. There's what will make you stay with something is the knowledge that got you there in the first place, and reminding yourself of that all the time with care for your body at the same time. But the belief will carry you through, and the rest you can learn.
I love that. Arm yourself with wisdom. So getting started, for those that don't know and those that are watching out there not listening, it's time to find out, like, what are the tips that you need to get started? So what are the top tips to get things going?
Well, I know I have to go fast now, so I would say start with the food you already like and decide what you already like is almost plant-based, if not entirely plant-based, and really add a lot of that to your diet. Anything that can have the animal foods just left out of it, start where you already are happy and go from there.
Yeah, I would just say ask a lot of questions, be curious, and focus on things that you can automatically reduce in your life, right? It's meat, chicken, fish. I didn't eat fish a lot growing up. I was like, eliminate fish. That's easy for me. One goal, go to the next every 3 months, 4 months, and then you're done. So yeah, thank you so much.
Amazing. And do check out Plant-Based News on Instagram and social media. Loads of knowledge there about plant-based food. And of course, yeah, thank you.
And also, I need to say one really important thing. Support and Feed, which is the organization that we started to provide nourishing plant-based meals to communities that lack access in food apartheids, nutrition deserts. That's what we do at Support and Feed, and we are really asking everybody. We started a pledge on Billie's tour with our sponsor, Wicked Kitchen, to ask everyone to eat at least one fully plant-based meal a day for 30 days. So that's a great place to start. If you could take that pledge with us, that actually makes an enormous impact. So thanks for taking the pledge.
Thanks so much, everyone.